February 28th, 1993, in Waco, Texas, a massacre began which would last for weeks to come. In Waco, Texas, dating all the way back to the early 1900s, there was a religious cult by the name of the Branch Davidians. The Branch Davidians were mostly exclusive to Waco and had a compound-style church on the nearby Mount Carmel. The current leader of the Branch Davidians at the time was a woman by the name of Lois Roden. Lois took power after her husband's death and preached equality more than the previous Branch Davidian leaders. She preached that the Holy Spirit was a woman and that the church was a place for spiritual role balance between men and women. Lois then befriended a much younger man by the name of Vernon Howell. Vernon had changed his name to something that most are familiar with today, David Koresh. Lois was 67 and David was 23 at the beginning of their relationship. That's kind of weird. That old freak Lois had a son named George, and David and him started to have a rivalry for who would be the next step in line for power after Lois was gone. George ultimately won this war of popularity between the Branch Davidians and had David Koresh, as well as his followers, expelled from Mount Carmel at gunpoint. The two would basically have political campaigns against one another. George called David a warlock.
George says you're a warlock and that you have the sign of an upside-down cross on your chest, and that's the sign of a warlock. You've studied Satanism.
And in response, Mr. David wrote a few catchy songs about George.
Please, 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 won't you listen? It's not what it appears to be. You didn't want to hurt anybody. Just let our old people free. There's a madman living in Waco. He's bowing his knee to bear. Won't you help, Mr. Sheriff?
The rivalry between the two later became violent and turned into a gunfight. George escaped with a flesh wound, and the followers of David who carried out the attack were arrested. For some reason, the charges on David and his followers for attempted murder didn't stick. David was then able to take control of the compound with a few of his men because George Roden had thousands of dollars in unpaid taxes on the property. After the two men both had their lives in danger and tried to host a Who's the Real Prophet competition by attempting to raise a woman from the dead, the Branch Davidian church was finally in the hands of David Koresh. David obviously had some violent tendencies, but it wasn't until he was in a position of power that he was able to show the other dark sides of him. David clearly had a perverted view of age gaps, considering he was fooling around with George's almost 70-year-old mother. But he started to shine some more light on that side of himself by marrying multiple women, some as young as 10 years old. David actually married a mother and her daughter once. David and his followers then began to start stockpiling weapons because Dave convinced them that there was a quote-unquote final battle between the Davidians and the U.S. government. Or more specifically how he stated it, the faithful versus the beast of Babylon. Waco citizens became fearful of the Branch Davidians because of the spread word of the modification of their weapons. They were illegally making fully automatic assault rifles as well as explosives and had shipments of grenades being brought to their door. The Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, or the ATF, were requested to investigate this issue. The ATF ends up getting a search warrant as well as an arrest warrant for David. Before the ATF could carry out this siege, a KWTX-TV reporter who was tipped off about the raid asked directions from a U.S. Postal Service worker who happened to be the brother-in-law of David Koresh. David was warned by this man, and the Branch Davidians were ready for war. David pleaded with an undercover ATF agent who was at the compound. The agent played dumb and was able to escape the compound. Apparently, as soon as the undercover agent left, everyone began praying. The standoff officially began, and David stepped out of the compound with his hands raised as the ATF had him at gunpoint. Then, a shot was fired. Nobody knows who did it, or what side did it, but that one gunshot started a war. David was shot in the stomach and in the hand and ran right back inside. As both sides participated in the shootout, a Branch Davidian man called 911 to try and get people to stop shooting because there was women and children inside the compound.
Oh, yeah, this is Lieutenant Lynch. May I help you?
Yeah, there's 75 men around our building and they're shooting at us in Mount Carmel.
Mount Carmel?
Yeah, tell them there are children and women in here and to call it off.
All right, hello? I hear gunfire. Oh, shit. Hello? Who is this? Hello?
Call it off!
Who is this?
After about 45 minutes of gunfire, things began to settle due to the ATF's lack of ammunition. There's death on both sides of the war. The ATF gathered their dead, and the Branch Davidians began to bury their own. Then the FBI gets involved days later and tries to negotiate. The FBI resulted in psychological warfare by pointing out spotlights and playing creepy noises to try and get the Davidians to leave the compound. After that didn't work, it was the Army's turn. The Army brought a tank with them and started to crush cars and fences outside. The FBI cut off their water and power. The FBI's new tactic was to freeze them out. None of that worked, so the final tactic was just to bust their way in. The US drove a tank straight through the compound and pumped tear gas to get everyone out. The siege had been ongoing for about 50 days at this point. After about 6 hours of gas bombing, fires broke out in the compound. The fire was the beginning to the end. Only 9 people left the compound after the fire. The rest were either burned, crushed, or shot. A total of 76 people died from this fire, and in the bunker where all the Branch Davidians had fled to, David Koresh was found with a gunshot wound to the head. I believe the most important impact of the Waco Siege is just the distrust between religion and government. And that had short-term effects, and they had people protesting this whole event. But I also think that this kind of just changed people's minds in a long-term way.